This afternoon, I'd like to introduce NAESP's Associate Executive Director for Professional Learning, Dr. Gracie Branch.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so happy to introduce you to our webinar speaker this afternoon. Dr. Peter DeWitt is a former K-5 teacher. He spent 11 years in the classroom and then was a principal for 8 years. He is known for running workshops and providing keynotes nationally as well as internationally, which focus on leadership, coaching, and fostering inclusive school climates. His work has been adopted at the university, state level, and national level. And he works with numerous districts across the United States, ministries of education, school boards, regional and state organizations where he trains leadership teams and coaches building leaders. Dr. DeWitt is also a well-known author. Two of his most recent books are Coach It Further, Using the Art of Coaching to Improve School Leadership, and Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice Out of Theory. His articles have appeared in education journals and at the state, national, and international level, and he has presented at forums, conferences, and panel discussions at state, national, and international conferences. We've been fortunate to have him present at NAESP, and he's also done presentations for ASCD and NBC's Education Nation. In other words, Dr. DeWitt, I think you do it all. So happy to introduce Dr. Peter DeWitt.
Thank you very much, Gracie. An honor. Thank you for having me. Welcome, everyone. So what I'd like to do is we're going to utilize the chat section. So if you could, would you introduce yourself? Tell me who you are, where you're from, and one thing you're grateful for today. I think that during these days of COVID-19 and everything else that's going on, we also have to talk about what we're grateful for. So introduce yourself, tell me your position or where you're from and what you're grateful for, please. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an idea of what we're going to cover in our time together. So it's instructional leadership, creating practice from theory. And what I would like for you to be able to do is I really want to be able to utilize the whole idea of using a poll. So David, thank you for being the first person to introduce yourself. For those of you that are watching right now, what I would love for you to be able to do on your phone or on your computer is put in www.menti.com, and I'd like you to use the code 7535485. I feel like it's my old locker number from 7th grade. So if you could, and as I'm reading people that are coming in the chat section, Bridget, elementary school principal, grateful for an amazing staff. That's awesome. Robin Cook from New Mexico, educational consultant. Thank you for being here. Fatima, thank you for being here. Jenny from Saudi Arabia. Wow, that's great. My brother lives in Bahrain, actually. So, or no, he doesn't. He used to live in Bahrain. He lives in Qatar. He moves so much. Elementary principal, grateful for everyone's patience and flexibility during this time. Mercedes, thank you for joining me, and Karen Cole, elementary principal in Arizona. I feel like I'm with my people, which is awesome because most of my experience is working in the elementary level, although I coach secondary and run workshops for everybody too. So far we have 4 people that have signed up for menti.com. We'll see how many we get, and then we'll utilize the polls. But I know that the content is what's going to be the most important for us to be able to get in. So once again, it's menti.com, and it's 75 35 48 and 5. Micheline, thank you very much for joining from Quebec, just north of me. I'm in Albany, New York, so thank you for being here. And Adrian coming in from New Jersey. All right, here we go. We're going to look at learning intentions. Our learning intentions are to talk about instructional leadership and what that might look like during the pandemic, and also how to reflect on our pandemic learning experiences from the spring and be able to move into virtual learning. I'll give that code one more time because I see that people are asking for it. So we only have another minute or so to be able to go. And maybe what I'll do is, just in order to give you some time, to be able to put in the code. I'll add in some dialogue here. So the instructional leadership work that I'm going to be talking about today is actually from research and a book that I wrote on instructional leadership, creating practice out of theory. And I travel a lot. Gracie was introducing me. And thank you, Honor, for putting the code in the chat box. So that's really great. But I travel a lot. And after the first week of March, traveling obviously stopped. And I was sitting at home trying to see what work was going virtual, what work was being pushed to next year, and how life was going to turn out. And I started to do some research in unconventional ways, meaning that I wanted to know how the instructional leadership work is going to partner up during COVID-19 and everything else. So what you're going to see during this presentation is both the research that I had done for the instructional leadership book pre-COVID, and then I'm going to talk about the unconventional way of doing research during COVID-19. So let's try this out. Let's see how this works. I've used Menti once so far, and that was a week ago. So let's see how it goes. What is your position in a school? Building leader, district leader, instructional coach, teacher leader, or school counselor? Right? I know. Well, we have we have 8 people, so that's good so far. So even though we have and more are coming through, so that's great. So a lot of building leaders so far, a good percentage that are there. I'm going to turn it down in just about 30 seconds, I would guess. So thank you for being here. The building leadership position was just such I loved being elementary school principal. As Gracie said, I was a principal for 8 years. I left 7 years ago to work with John Hattie and Jim Knight and work as a consultant and author. Okay, so now that we have a sense for who's here, we're going to move on to this. Instructional leadership. So it is the most researched form of school leadership over the past 50 years. The interesting thing is that even though it's the most researched form of school leadership, many times what the researchers said is it's like a black box. We know that it has an impact on student learning, but we're not quite sure why or how. And I do a lot of international travel. And you would think that this whole argument between instructional leadership and management is something that we might only see in the United States, but that is not true. I do a lot of work in the UK, in Europe, and Australia, and Canada. And the management issue versus instructional leadership is something that we see all around the world. So my plan was to actually break it down to what instructional leadership should look like. And that's what you're going to see in this presentation. But I want to expand the view because too often when we look at instructional leadership, we have this building level mentality, like it's just about the school principal. And I love that because I was a school principal. But very often in my trainings, when I'm doing workshops or when I'm coaching, we have instructional coaches, we have teacher leaders. And then I get asked a lot about things like PLCs. And the reality is when we're looking at PLCs and we have PLC leads, how do we get deeper with our PLCs or our grade levels or our departments if those people in charge, the teacher in charge of those sessions, don't have an instructional leadership background, don't have credibility in that way, or don't even know what first steps to take, right? They show up to a meeting, there might be more collaboration, but it doesn't mean it necessarily has an impact on student learning. So therefore, I wanted to expand on the definition of instructional leadership, and that's what you see up on the screen. It's about focusing our efforts and our implementation, something very important to be able to talk about, on high impact practices that are going to positively impact student learning. And we're going to talk about the practical and the philosophical. Now, for instructional leadership, there are lots of different things that we can do. And just so you know, you will get a copy of this presentation. I sent it to Honor yesterday, and it will be available for all of you, so you will get a copy of that. But instructional leadership, you can look at, I've got building leader, instructional coaches, teacher leaders, and PLC leads or department chairs across the top. And then I have a bunch of things that we need to think about for learning and being an instructional leader. Now, this is the argument that I received when I was doing the research. I would talk to principals or I would read some research and it would say, but instructional leadership is just a small part of what we need to be able to do as school leaders. And I get it. I didn't have assistant principals. But I went from classroom to classroom every single morning to do my morning rounds. And then I went back into classrooms to get a focus on learning and see what was going on. I flipped my faculty meetings so we could talk about learning. The reality is, when people say instructional leadership is just a small focus of what we need to be able to do, they are right. But the problem is, if we get that small focus wrong, it can have a devastating impact. Imagine it this way. We go in to do our walkthrough, something many leaders I work with are supposed to be doing. And when they go in to do their walkthroughs, they might have a walkthrough bias where they look for something in a classroom, like a Pinterest classroom, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's having a deep impact on student learning. And they don't necessarily look for the same thing that the teacher wants them to look for. Often, too, you can see this up on the screen, we have a common language, but we don't have a common understanding. So we talk about words like the growth mindset, or we talk about differentiated instruction or formative assessment. But the reality is we don't often have a common understanding behind that. So we might talk about something like student engagement, but my idea of student engagement might be compliant engagement, and your idea of student engagement might be authentic engagement. And if we never talk about that, if we only have the common language, but we don't have the common understanding, then that small piece of instructional leadership is going to miss the mark, and it's going to have a devastating impact on student learning. I know that many of you that are watching today are brand new leaders, and there's a lot for you to be able to look at and think about. But I want you to think about this. There is nothing more important, especially right now, than building relationships. I was hired 4 months before I officially started. My then secretary gave me a yearbook, and she said, I want you to study the pictures of the kids, and I want you to study the teachers. And their names are in the yearbook, but I wrote their spouses' names. So even though I was teaching in a high poverty city school, I would go home and I would study the yearbook. And by the time I got to the school officially, I knew everybody's name. So that relationship piece is hugely important. People love when you know their names, especially students. But the other thing is, when are you going to carve out time in your day to focus on learning? Are you going to do virtual walkthroughs? If you're in session, it's about how do you get away from your desk? Is there any lull in your day when you can go into some classrooms and talk to students about what they're learning, not what they're doing, but what they're learning? If it's virtual or remote, is it possible for you to do virtual walkthroughs where you can get a sense of what virtual learning looks like within your school? So when it comes to instructional leadership, we know that confidence is a really big issue. So let's try this. What best describes, wow, some of you are like right on the spot, that's awesome. What best describes your level of confidence when it comes to instructional leadership? Give you about a minute to put this in. I love the very confidence, that's really awesome. All right, so we're moving up. I see more people are joining Mentimeter, and you can see the code on the top too for those of you that are just coming in. I know that you're coming from hectic days. Obviously, if you watch when this is recorded and you're watching the recorded section, you're not going to want to do this. All right, so what best describes? So we have confident is the one in the lead. We've got very confident. We've got 7 people right now who are very confident, and then we've got somewhat confident. So that's really great. So let me talk to you a little bit about why I asked that. So in order to do the research around instructional leadership for the book, pre-COVID, I surveyed hundreds of school principals, and then I asked them in many questions, or about 8 to 10 questions. One was, I'm confident I'm an instructional leader. And you can see the percentages up on the screen. 24% said I'm very confident. 43% said I'm confident. And then you can see how it rounds out. And it was really interesting because I was working with a group of principals in Toronto, and one of the principals who I had been working with probably 3 or 4 times came up to me and he said, Peter, I'm one of your 8%. And I asked him, why are you not confident? He goes, no, I'm literally one of your 8%. I filled out your survey. So what I would like in the chat box, if you can, for all of you, doesn't matter how you answered, what makes you so confident? What makes you very confident? What makes you confident? What makes you somewhat confident? Put that in the chat box for me, please. I'd like to see. What gives you the sense that you're either very confident, you're confident, or you're somewhat confident? Start putting that in the chat box. Who's going to be brave enough to put it first? The one thing I've learned from remote webinars is that the idea of being patient in my wait time. Okay, so Mercedes, this is my second year as an elementary AP, and I taught secondary for 13 years. Okay, confident. Jenny, teachers seek me out for feedback and advice on instructional practices. That's awesome. Marianne, I am confident. Marianne, I am confident because of my years of experience. Kathy, semi-confident. And then Adrian, professional development and reading materials helps you become more confident. So what I decided to do after I had asked this question of leaders, because I thought it was very good news that so many felt confident, that I actually went through, and I see Denise is putting knowledge of content, and Catalina is putting in confident because I've been in the classroom long enough, okay? Chimera, semi-confident, so thank you for putting that in. What I wanted to do is I wanted to get a sense of, this is what principals feel about their own level of confidence, but what about the teachers in the school buildings? What about them? So what I did was I sent out a survey to teachers, hundreds of replies, and one of the questions was, I'm confident my principal is an instructional leader. And as you can see, the idea of very confident went down, confident went down, and then somewhat confident and not confident at all went up. So the thing that I want you to keep in mind is that we can feel very confident, but it doesn't necessarily mean it leads to competence. So when we ask teachers how confident they feel in their principal being an instructional leader, you can see that the percentages go down, and you need to understand there's always a discrepancy. There's a discrepancy between how students feel and how teachers feel about the same topic. There's a discrepancy between how teachers feel and how principals feel about the same topic. But this one I think is really important, especially when it comes to instructional leadership, because what I feel is that it also means that proximity matters. If Gracie is a teacher that I get along with very well, maybe she teaches a subject that I taught before, and I'm in her classroom a lot and we're talking about learning, then Gracie's going to fill out the survey and she's going to say, I'm very confident Peter's an instructional leader. But say Honor is somebody that I don't know as well, and she teaches with her door closed, and I don't like to enter into a classroom when the door is closed. She's going to fill out the survey and she's going to say, I'm not very confident that Peter's an instructional leader because I don't see him that often. So this whole idea of confidence can be based on proximity, and that's why things like flipped faculty meetings are walkthroughs or learning walks, whatever we might call them, or the formal observations that we go through. Those are vitally important. It shows how important it really is. But it's also important for those of you that say, I'm very confident or I'm confident, to also be able to gather evidence to say it's more than confidence, it also shows competence as well. Now, the rest of our time, we're going to quickly go through these 6. I need you to know that I run full day workshops. I run multiple day workshops, and about 85% of my work is repeat work with school districts. So we're going to go through these quickly, but oftentimes what we do is we will take one and go deep in each and every one of them, whether it's remote learning or whether it's in-person learning too. Those 6 are implementation, a focus on learning, student engagement, instructional strategies, efficacy, and evidence of impact. So we're going to start with implementation. And out of all the things that I talked about in the book, Instructional Leadership, Creating Practice Out of Theory, the first thing I talked about was implementation, because very often in schools, we don't implement well. We have so many things we're responsible for. And we've got the implementation dip that can happen. Even if it's something that we really want to be able to do, we know that we can get pushback. We know that we can get tired. We know that we can get hit with other accountability measures. So that implementation dip can really prevent us from following through on an improvement. So a program logic model has been around for a very long time. And the thing about a program logic model is it can be quite complicated. For those of you who've seen them before, you know that they can be very complicated. I tried to make it as simple as possible. And the good news is that it's been used at the state level, industry level. So it comes down to needs. What's your current reality? Think about now during COVID. That's what I want you to mostly think about, because many of you might be experiencing remote learning in the fall, or some of you might have hybrid. So what's your current reality? Where do you want to improve? And what does your evidence show you? Now, the spring was hard. It was pandemic teaching and learning. But we also know that it was a learning lesson. We learned what works, what doesn't work. So in the chat box, I'm going to keep going, but in the chat box, when you're looking at this today, where is there an area that you as a leader with your school, not alone, but you as a leader with your school, where do you want to improve? Number 2 on the list is inputs. These are the resources necessary to meet your goal. So after in the chat box, you put in where you as a school want to improve. You start to think about what are the inputs we need? What are the resources? Elena, student engagement and aid, perfect. That's going to be coming up, so I love that. Resources necessary to meet your goal. I'm going to give you some practical examples next, but they're things like time and research-based activities. Jenny, relationship building. In the middle is activities. What activities are going to help you meet your goal? And then we have outputs. How will you begin taking actionable steps? I'm often asked, so why did you put out and activity? Well, the reality is we can list activities along, but it doesn't mean that we're actually going to step up and do them. It's kind of like a diet. We can talk about we're going to go on a diet for months or years, but it's until we take those actionable steps that it's actually going to make some improvements. So outputs are where you put a timestamp on. And then impact is actually how are teachers and students going to benefit from this? The problem is this. When I work with districts, there are many districts that have a load of activities that they do. But when it comes to impact and you start asking, how are teachers and students going to benefit? They find that they're activity rich and impact poor. It's actually a blog that I wrote. You're going to be able to get it in the list of resources that Honor just put into the chat box. Activity rich and impact poor. And what we want to make sure is that when we're thinking about instructional leadership, when we're thinking about how we're experiencing COVID-19, how we're going to experience the fall, and we use a program logic model, we know that we no longer have time to be activity rich and impact poor. We want to engage in activities that are actually going to have a deep impact. So let's look at that. In the unconventional research that I've done, and I'll get more into that as we go through, what I found is that we were in a pandemic teaching experience, right? This was not real remote teaching, because remote teaching takes time and resources and communication with families and make sure everybody has access. For us, it happened overnight. So it's pandemic teaching and learning. But so under need, you can see knowing that the virtual experience will always evolve. You know, we want to have a deeper impact on students. So what can we do? Well, the inputs, Facebook pandemic pages. I actually used 2 of those that had over 200,000 members within days of when the pandemic hit. And I started to code the comments and questions. 950 comments and questions at that time came up on both of those pandemic pages. And I started to pull them and put them in an Excel spreadsheet, and I started to code them based on the instructional leadership work. That is a resource for me. Research-based articles. I'm a big fan of research. I work with John Hattie. I do research on my own. I've written research papers. I love looking at research. Virtually everything we do has been research. It's important to go there first because it shows the work that has already gone into it. YouTube experts. I am talking to you from a desktop that I bought 2 months ago. I haven't had a desktop in 7 years, but I needed to get one because I knew my life was going to be virtual. But I also downloaded things like Adobe for my computer so I could create videos for a show that I do for Education Week called A Seat at the Table. I had to go to YouTube to look at how to do things, how to do breakout sessions in Zoom. There's a YouTube expert for that. How to use, Adobe Premiere to create videos. There are numerous experts for that. YouTube can be a really cool place to be able to learn from. Models of successful practice. We know that there are schools that were already doing hybrid learning very well. So those are schools that we might want to be able to tap into. And then the activities are what you put in the middle, Zoom or Google Meet. I'm going to give you a little bit more information on why those are important, even though many of us are tired of them. They're really important. Kids in surveys that I did talked about that. Flexible schedules and timetables. Timetables are what they call schedules in Australia. Office hours and communication home. Virtual teachers and classroom teachers. And then for Education Week, my editor told me people were looking into looping because it created, you already had that relationship with the kids. I looped as an elementary school teacher, and then I had teachers that looped when I was a school principal. And then you can see things in Zoom, in outputs. And those are those actionable steps that I had mentioned already. You know, starting next week, we'll teach some content. And then, of course, the impact is through engagement, we can continue to move from pandemic and crisis teaching to a more virtual or remote teaching experience. Another one, pandemic. It's a lot of the same material that I had in the other one, but in the middle, there are things like remote PLCs. How are we utilizing those? Because there's never more important a time than ever than right now for our PLCs to function well together. But things like PBL, because what we know is I'm a big fan of flipped learning. So we can, if we're going to do hybrid, then we can do flipped learning so kids can get the surface level information at home. And then when they're actually at school, they can go in and do project-based learning, or quite the opposite. We can do the surface-based learning with teacher clarity and learning intentions at school. And then when they go home, we can do PBL there where they can do project-based learning because it provides them with flexibility and it gets them off the computer. Outputs, once again, are where we make sure that we're taking actionable steps. I run a lot of workshops, so my typical 6 or 7 hour day workshop has turned out to be 3 2-hour sessions in between day 1 and day 2 and day 2 and day 3. I utilize things like Flipgrid. I use SurveyMonkey and those kind of things to keep the dialogue going and create a community of learners. And then, of course, impact. It's all about making sure that we're having a deeper impact on the learning that's taking place. What this leads into is a focus for learning, and I want you to think about it this way. When we're thinking about being an instructional leader with a focus on learning, we need to sit down and look at how are we going to implement this, because we can't, it's one of my frustrations is that as much as I love social media, you will have people tweeting out how they're doing walkthroughs or learning walks, and it just looks so easy. And then we stand up and we decide we're going to go in and do the same thing, but we've never talked to the teachers about it. That's a problem because that creates one-sided dialogue. And it also can create a negative school climate atmosphere because walkthroughs are typically things that are done to teachers, not things that are done with them. So when we can look at things like a program logic model, sit down with our teacher teams and talk about what this might look like. And I've always prided myself as a principal of walking in with one idea, but walking out with a better one. I don't like walking in with one idea and walking out with the same one because that makes me wonder, why did I even have the meeting in the first place? So when we can go through a program logic model and we can start talking about what's the improvement we want to look at and work on, what might this look like in our classrooms, you're building the success criteria together with your teachers. What it goes into is a focus for learning. And one of the things that I decided to do, and like I said, we can't get deeply into all of this, but I know that there are schools that are doing depths of knowledge, which I think is really great. But I think there's an earlier step that we as principals might want to be able to look at, because when I'm working with leadership teams, and I work with countless leadership teams from K to 12, small schools, large schools, different countries, many times what happens is that we'll go in to do our walkthroughs and we don't always know what to look for. We have a walkthrough bias because we're looking for that Pinterest classroom, or we think we know what good learning looks like, but we haven't talked to our staff about it. So we go in and we just look for the way things are being questioned, or we look for student engagement, which actually really means to some time on task, which is not authentic engagement. It's compliant engagement. So when we can develop something like an understanding around knowledge dimensions, This is a really good starting point for us as leaders to be able to talk with teachers. Factual knowledge. Comes from Bloom's Revised Taxonomy from Anderson from 2001. We have factual knowledge, isolated bits of facts. We know these pieces, vocabulary definitions. Conceptual knowledge. Conceptual knowledge consists of systems of information, categories. Those are things that I remember doing as a first grade teacher. And then we have procedural knowledge, which is the knowledge of skills, vitally important. And then, of course, we round out with metacognitive knowledge, which is the whole idea of the thinking processes. I want to give you some specific examples of what this looks like. I said before that I work with John Hattie. We often present together and we write together. And so when we're looking at factual knowledge, it might be something like, what does a 0.40 effect size mean in Hattie's research? Before I tell the answer, and I'm going to move on to the others, somebody in the chat box, what does a 0.40 effect size mean in Hattie's research? And I'll come back to it. Conceptual knowledge. What is the relationship between equity and the percentage of students who are engaging in virtual learning? Equity is a very big topic, and it's much bigger than just the virtual learning piece. But Caleb, it means you pay attention to it. Yes, it does, but can you give me any specifics on that one, Caleb? Very good answer. That was nice. I like that. Very good. So what's the relationship between equity and the percentage of students who are engaging in virtual learning? I do a lot of work in Salinas, California, in Soledad, California. And they had students that were not necessarily showing up because they didn't have access. So they did a really neat thing in Monterey County. They actually worked with city transit. And the city transit buses have Wi-Fi. So they would go to different parts of the community and sit for a couple of hours at the time so kids could have access. Was it perfect? No, but it was a really great start. I train all the instructional coaches for New York City. And Andrew Fletcher, who's in charge of pre-K through second grade instructional coaches in New York City, they work together with the public TV station and they created a Let's Learn New York City. And so it's free public broadcasting because they found that 99% of people had TVs and free public broadcasting, and every day for 2 hours, Monday through Friday, they actually go through lessons in both English and Spanish, and they have closed captioning as well for the hearing impaired. So those are some things people have actually done. Robin, he defines a 0.4 to be the hinge point, an effect size at which an initiative can be said to have a greater than average influence. 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth for a year's input. So thank you for that. Procedural knowledge. One of the frustrating things that I saw from teachers was that students weren't uploading things on Google Classroom. It was coming in blank. So procedural knowledge is teaching kids how to upload documents to Google Classroom. And then, of course, we have metacognitive knowledge. Because what we found is that in the spring, there was a lot of talking at students. And what students told me in surveys is that they wanted to be able to engage in dialogue with their peers. And I asked them open questions in the survey, for which I got results from well over several hundred students from 4 different countries. And when you ask them an open question, they have really great opinions on how learning should look for them right now. So one of the metacognitive questions is, how can you as a learner help create a more positive virtual learning experience? So what I would like, let's try this one more time. In your experience, engaging in learning walks and formal observations, rank the order of knowledge dimensions you see the most to the least. Just in your classrooms that you go through, out of the knowledge dimensions, which ones, rank them in order of which ones you see the most to the least. Let's see if this works. Oh, look at that. That happened really quick. All right, so I'm sorry, Adrian, that you were having issues with Menti. So what we can see right now is from our small group that's taking part in this, we've got factual, then procedural, conceptual, and metacognitive. And I have to tell you that in all the times that I've asked that question over the past year, it has not changed. We have factual, procedural, conceptual, and metacognitive. I'm glad to see people that actually say they see metacognitive, because sometimes I work with leaders that say they don't see metacognitive. Now, here's the thing. For elementary, we know that this is also what's the age appropriateness of these questions. Factual, there is a place for factual when we're working with our K2 students or with our 3-5 students. There's a place for procedural. We understand that. But what we want to be able to do is, because it can be age appropriate for metacognitive and conceptual as well, is to be able to increase the amount of metacognitive and conceptual we see. I want to just give you one example. This is a really great resource. It's also in the Google Doc, but it comes from my friend Julie Stern, who I love her work on conceptual understanding. But these are just examples of activities that kids can either do in the classroom or at home. And it's important for them to go through the cognitive conflict of deciding how to do this. Now, clearly, this takes a lot of teacher clarity, it takes learning intentions, it takes success criteria, but it's state, elaborate, exemplify, and illustrate. Now, these are conceptual activities that students can do, and they do go into the metacognitive activity too, but she's got a really great website called Education to Save the World, and you can find resources for parents, for remote learning, for in-classroom learning, and they're all there. So those 4 knowledge dimensions are something to kind of keep in mind as well. What we know is that we've also got to worry about student engagement. Student engagement is really important. And this research comes from Odatella from 72. But what Odatella found is that students are disengaged with us for one of 2 reasons, or both. Identification. They don't feel a sense of belonging to their school or to the classroom. And then they feel powerless. They don't feel like they have a voice in their own learning. Now, obviously, we have students that can have both, or we can have students that can have one or the other. But that whole idea of student engagement is really important, because what we know from the spring is that we had students that didn't show up. And part of the reason why is because they didn't feel that sense of belonging before COVID. So when they sort of got the no harm grading policy, they thought, maybe I don't have to go back. And yes, there are other reasons, which I'll get into. Now, I asked students, several hundred, 4 different countries, why don't I engage with my teachers? Connecting to the internet is an issue. The assignments. And in the other spot, they put things like, we haven't had virtual learning yet, which was a little disturbing because it was April when some of the students were writing the answers in. Other times they wanted to explore the assignments and they said they're too hard, or they're too easy, or they happen too often. And then we can see finding a quiet place to work. Just like many of you may be looking behind me to see what I have behind me in my office, students didn't necessarily want to engage with us because they have multiple siblings or even multiple families in the house. So they couldn't find a quiet place. And then, of course, how often they were asked to hand in the assignments. Now, one of the things that I did back in March, when I looked at the Facebook pandemic pages, when I coded, and when I looked at what does this mean for instructional leadership? What does this mean for a focus on learning? We have kids that aren't showing up and people are frustrated. There were 6 reasons. And I wrote this blog and it got 120,000 views within 3 days. And it's had hundreds of thousands of views ever since. There were 6 reasons. They didn't have access. They became essential workers, the older kids. No grade incentive, no harm grading policy. Your grade from third period or third quarter is not going to change. So therefore, they kind of stepped back, which is sad for me because we need kids to come to school for more than just a grade, right? We want them to come for learning. They had to take care of their siblings. So there were times that kids didn't show up, the younger kids didn't show up for you in the elementary world because maybe their older siblings weren't doing a good job of taking care of them. Bedlam but no bedroom, just what I said earlier. It gave us a different window into the world of our students, and they didn't always like that. And then last but not least is student-teacher relationships. If I didn't think you liked me pre-March, then I probably might not show up post-March. So these are some things to think about as well. And what that became, this is why it's so important that we talk about these things as instructional leaders. What do our virtual faculty meetings need to focus on? Not tasks, not things that they can just read in an email, but we need to talk about this. Our loss of control. It was frustrating in March, April, May, and June, because we no longer have that proximity over students. We couldn't put them a good or a bad grade. We couldn't take away from them an extra privilege. And what that meant is that we had a loss of control, and that was not comfortable. So these are the things from an instructional leadership standpoint that in your PLCs, in your faculty meetings, in your formal observations that you need to be doing even if they're virtual, these are the things we need to be able to talk about. The sad part is too, when I looked at engagement, I asked students, how often do your teachers ask you for input? And you can see that 74% of them said never. Then you can see monthly, weekly, and daily. And just like I said, there's a discrepancy between students and teachers and principals. When I asked teachers the same question, it changed a little bit, but there was still a large percentage that said never. And then there were teachers that said, I ask on a weekly or bi-weekly status. So when you are thinking about what am I walking away from with this presentation on instructional leadership, let me do some of the work for you. How often do you look at your present circumstance and look at it from a program logic model standpoint? How often do you engage teachers in that discussion? How do you take what you learned from the spring and take it into the fall? How often do you talk about conceptual understanding, procedural understanding, and what that can look like in classrooms and what that can look like in virtual or in hybrid sessions? And it's about how often do you ask students what it is that they want to learn? Because they will tell you, because they certainly told me. Their least favorite lessons, worksheets, PowerPoint slides that had too many words, kind of like the one that's up on the screen. Videos that were an hour long. They literally said in the surveys that their teachers would talk to them in a recorded lesson for 45 minutes to an hour. And other times, teachers would just talk at students and the students had to be muted. They didn't use the chat box. When I have longer sessions with the school districts I'm working with, we utilize the chat box. We utilize breakout sessions. Favorite lessons, collaborative activities with peers, lessons that allowed them to engage in Zoom chat rooms. They liked office hours. They liked that time with their teacher. And here's the thing. Some of you from the elementary level will say, well, I know we have students that didn't talk when they were on Zoom, but there were articles and there were surveys done by parents that said, I know my kid doesn't talk during the Zoom, but he's really listening. He's actually paying attention. He's just nervous to talk. That's great. So I see that Fatima, I have closure activities through which I get students' feedback. That's awesome to be able to do those kind of things. So being able to do things like short lectures or learning to complete, doing a 15-minute lesson where you're talking about where you're showing teacher clarity and you're providing the learning intention. And then giving them an activity to be able to do off screen, hugely important. I know that in Ontario, Canada, they were talking about having 2 or 3 required Zoom meetings per week between teachers and students, because students from a social emotional level need to see the adults. And just so you know, as principals, your teachers need to see you as well. I work with school districts and we're doing virtual walkthroughs. I'm actually coaching on Thursday and Friday, and we're doing virtual walkthroughs with our leaders into classrooms so we can see what virtual learning looks like and we can talk about it. There are instructional strategies that lead to social emotional engagement and academic engagement. And one of my favorites, and I know that our time is not easily done and I'm throwing these 6 to you, but reciprocal teaching. This is something that is done at the elementary level. Doug Fisher and Nancy Fry have a great column in Ed Leadership. It's actually in your Google Doc. It comes with a video, and yes, it's about what it looks like in person, but I've actually used this activity with the school districts I work with from a remote standpoint. They have to read the article from Doug and Nancy, And then the next day when we get together, I put them in breakout rooms and I break them up to do the 4 different jobs for reciprocal teaching. So these are things that we can do. And not only should we expect teachers to be able to do something like reciprocal teaching, we should be doing this by modeling it with our teachers during our faculty meetings. Flipped faculty meetings, something I used to do as a school principal. And I would send the article on reciprocal teaching to teachers before our virtual faculty meeting. And then I would put them in breakout rooms to do reciprocal teaching around that. Do the activities that you want to see in classroom. Talk about those things with your teachers. We know that it breaks down to this, clarify, predict, question, summarize. And that's what reciprocal teaching is all about. Another thing to always look for from a student engagement / instructional strategy standpoint is the idea of teacher clarity. I've mentioned it several times, but this is the original work from Bush, Kennedy, and Cruikshank. There are 5 factors that you can see up on the screen. Teacher clarity is vitally important because even in the student surveys that I received, students had cognitive conflict at home, but they didn't know what to do because the teacher wasn't necessarily clear in the classroom. So if we want to do short videos, if we want to flip learning, we need to make sure teacher clarity is a piece of what we're talking about, and then students will be more apt to do it on their own. This is the opportunity that we have right now. Too often in the classroom, we make it easy for students. If they don't answer a question, we hurry up and give them the answer, or we hurry up and call on our default student who's going to give the answer. And at that moment, we just took all the power away from that one student who was not answering the question as quickly as we wanted, and we just told the rest of the class, if you don't want to answer or engage, just stay silent because the teacher will go somewhere else. What we know is that when students were home alone, they struggled because they were so used to that dynamic where they didn't necessarily have to go through cognitive conflict. This is an opportunity to be able to do that because that cognitive conflict is real and important. Teacher clarity can help us. Gracie, great advice. Do the activities that you want to see in the classroom. Thank you. I always want to model what it is that I want to see. When I'm running workshops for school districts, I want to model what it is we want to talk about and do with our teachers. We want to be able to work that out because it's so easy to tell somebody what to do, but not see what can happen when we're doing it ourselves. Let's face it, even when it comes to remote learning, it was easy for me to write a blog for Finding Common Ground for Education Week and say, this is what you should be doing. But when I was running workshops and my computer shut down and I had to turn it on and start over again, even though I had 300 people on a webinar, that's uncomfortable. When slides didn't look correctly, when I talked too much during a 2 or 3 hour workshop and we didn't do breakout sessions, when I provided too much philosophy, not enough solutions. Those are things that we learn by doing. So we need to do that together as a staff. We need to take those risks. We know from Hattie's work with Gregory Donahue that there are surface to deep learning strategies. We know that there's acquiring surface level to consolidating surface level. The thing about it is this: when we're thinking about doing our walkthroughs, do we understand that if a teacher's doing highlighting and note-taking, at that particular time, that might be the best thing for them to be able to do? Do we understand that there are specific strategies that can be used for specific moments in time, meaning acquiring surface level to consolidating? Instructional leadership is about that. It's not always about understanding the standard or the necessary content. If we don't understand that, we can ask our teachers, what is the vocabulary you want students to be able to understand? So then when I go in and sit down with them, we can have that dialogue. But what is important for us to understand is what strategies will match up for the kind of learning that we want. What matters for us as instructional leaders is to understand that we have to be looking at surface level and deep level and transfer level learning, no matter what grade that we were talking about. That is the important part to instructional leadership. So I know that I'm getting some questions about the presentation, and yes, the presentation will definitely be available. It's in the resources, honor, receive that. This is just one slide. Don't need to get into, but I just wanted to give you a cross section of what surface to deep, the transfer level can look like in John Hattie's work. So this is just an example without, you can check it out in presentation when you receive it. And then of course, when we're thinking about how this looks in a high moment, we've got things synchronous, concept mapping. Can we do that together? Scaffolding, inquiry-based teaching, reciprocal teaching. We have asynchronous, things like sketchnoting or flipped learning that they can do on their own. That's going to offer deep, offers transfer. We can see what offers surface level learning. So these are pieces you can pay attention to in the presentation. Remember that when we're talking about instructional leadership and what we want learning, how we want learning to improve from the spring to the fall, is that we want to be able to talk about what did we learn and how can we go from surface to deep to transfer. What we're going to round out with is self-efficacy. And efficacy, for those of you that don't know, was studied from Bandura. This is from 1997, but his research is back from 77 out of Stanford University. It refers to our own belief, our own capabilities. So it means how confident we are in our actions. And the interesting thing about self-efficacy is that it is context specific. So you might be very confident as a manager, but you're not as an instructional leader. And what Bandura found in 2000 is that if that's the case, if you are really confident as a manager, but not confident as an instructional leader, what that means is that you might double down and spend all your time doing management and slacken your efforts with instructional leadership. You have teachers, that's the same thing. They might be super confident when it comes to relationships, but they might lack confidence when it comes to using different instructional strategies. So just remember that when you're your faculty meeting and you're doing a virtual faculty meeting, please expect everybody in your class or in your school to understand the same about something that you do, because self-efficacy works that way. Confident in certain situations, not confident in the other, and that changes depending on the person that we are working with. And what's even more complicated is that the discrepancy model shows that 45% of teachers completely agree that their principals support them. 86% of principals completely agree that they support their teachers to do innovative work. So only 45% of teachers believe the principal is going to support them, but 86% of principals believe they are supportive. So our actions, activity rich, impact poor. We might be involved in activities that we think are showing that they are supportive of our teachers being innovative, when really they have a negative impact. Are you activity rich and impact poor? There are efficacy experiences, mastery experiences. Going through a challenging event is a way we raise efficacy. Learners. So when I talked about modeling, faculty meeting, virtual faculty meeting, breakout sessions, that's vicarious learning, learning from somebody else. Social persuasion. When we go in to do our virtual walkthroughs, it's really important to be able to give that positive feedback to our teachers, to be able to raise up their level of efficacy. But because what we know is their effective states. When teachers are excited, they're diving in and they want to do more. When they're anxious, which many are now because they've gone through the 5 stages of grief, one of the things that we have to know is that increases anxiety, and that does not help raise efficacy. So what you need to know as an instructional leader is that we've got teachers right now that are going through those stages of grief, and they don't feel confident, and they find it to be very anxious, and that doesn't actually breed high levels of efficacy. But how you help them learn in your faculty meetings or virtual walkthroughs do. There are lots of things that we need to keep in mind. Topics of interest. One of the things that I've been exploring a lot on my Ed Week show, Seat at the Table, is the idea of equity and race and racial reckoning. I had Tyrone Howard and Jaleel Howard on yesterday, father, son from UCLA. And we had a deep discussion about race. These are things that we don't necessarily feel comfortable to talk about, but these are the very topics we need to talk about. Pedagogy and technology. Too often what happened in the spring is that it was, here's this tool, use this to engage the students. But what we know is that we have to have a balance between pedagogy and technology. And then, of course, things like school climate are very important. There are different levels of efficacy. There's self-efficacy, which is our personal efficacy, right? And then there's collective teacher efficacy, how teams of teachers in your PLCs or grade levels work together around a common goal and try out different instructional strategies and collect evidence to understand impact. Evidence to understand impact, evidence to understand impact, very important. Collective leader efficacy, how you as an administrative team work together, principals and assistant principals, and you work on things like common language and common understanding and what learning looks like and how can we have an anti-racist community. Those are the things we can work on as a collective leader team to get all of our ducks in a row and then start working with staff. So what we're going to do is look, and this is where we end, which is on evidence of impact. And I just want to know, do you collect evidence to understand your impact? We can't do it from the gut anymore. And what does that evidence look like? Who's involved in the process? If I'm collecting evidence with my teachers, I ask them, let's talk about what makes good evidence. Now, there are people that will say, can I have a list? And I have a short one. But I want you to leave with this. The best evidence you can collect is the evidence that you decide together with your teams of teachers. If we really want to have this impact, what evidence can we collect to show that we're having it? Student engagement. I work with a school district and their middle school is collecting evidence right now to see what students are engaging. They have 3 periods a day. Are they engaging in all 3, just 2, or just 1? Virtual walkthroughs. When we're doing virtual walkthroughs, do we see the actions that we wanted teachers to take from what we taught them about and learn together in our faculty meetings? And for faculty meetings, virtual faculty meetings. Do we talk about learning and then do we see those strategies playing out in the classroom? Evidence collection is highly important. If you want to contact me, my Twitter address is there and my email address is as well. Thank you very much for your time. Gracie, I give you 3 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. DeWitt. We really, really appreciate you being here today. Now I have a new favorite quote or kind of a meeting mantra, and that's walking in with one idea and walking out with a better one. I love that. That should be about every meeting, shouldn't it?
It really should.
So thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. You've given us a lot of great ideas to think about. We appreciate you tying it to the challenges that people are going through with COVID, and hopefully we can get you back here pretty soon.
All right, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, everybody. Good luck in the fall.